Imagine being sentenced to death for wearing the wrong clothes, or watching a courtroom trial and where the accused wasn't a human. In 1386, in the town of Falaise, France, a pig was arrested, dressed in human clothes, brought before a judge, given a formal trial, and publicly executed in the town square while the townspeople watched. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a legend. It was documented, official, legal, and it was just one of hundreds of cases that happened across medieval Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, a continent of millions lived under a system of laws so brutal, so bizarre, and so deeply strange that when you hear them today, your first instinct is to laugh, until you realize they were completely real, and that people died because of them. This is Savage Century, and today we're going back to a world where the law wasn't designed to protect you, it was designed to control you. Law 1. Hunting the king's deer could cost you your hand. In 1079, King William I of England, the man who conquered the country just 13 years earlier, declared something extraordinary. The forests of England now belonged to him. Every deer, every boar, every rabbit within those boundaries was royal property, and anyone caught hunting without permission faced what was written directly into law as blinding and castration. A man named Alwyn of Lincolnshire was documented as having his right hand severed after being caught with a single deer. He hadn't stolen gold, he hadn't attacked anyone, he had fed his family. The law was called the Forest Charter, and it covered over a third of England's entire land. For 200 years, peasants starved on the edge of forests full of food they were forbidden to touch. Law 2. Your clothes could get you arrested. In 1363, the English Parliament passed the Sumptuary Law. It was precise, specific, ruthless. Fur trimming on clothing, only for nobles earning over £100 a year. Purple silk, reserved exclusively for the royal family. Velvet, only for knights and above. If a merchant's wife was seen wearing an embroidered gown in public, she could be fined, stripped of the garment on the street, and publicly shamed. One documented case in Florence, Italy, involved a cloth merchant who was fined 40 florins, nearly 2 months of wages, for wearing a jacket with gold buttons. The buttons were illegal, not because they were stolen, because he wasn't noble enough to own them. Law 3. You could be condemned without evidence in medieval England and France if you were accused of a crime and there was no witness. The court had a solution. They threw you into water. This was called trial by ordeal. The logic was theological. God would protect the innocent. If you floated, you were guilty, because the pure water had rejected your soul. If you sank, you were innocent. You were also drowning. A documented case from 12th century England describes a woman named Godgifu accused of poisoning her husband. She was bound and thrown into the River Thames. She sank. She was pulled out, declared innocent, and died 3 days later from her injuries. Justice, medieval style. Law 4. Criticizing a priest could mean the stake in 1415 in the city of Constance in what is now Germany. A scholar named Jan Hus was burned alive. His crime? He had written pamphlets arguing that church leaders should not own land or accumulate wealth. He wasn't calling for violence. He wasn't leading a rebellion. He was a university professor with a pen and an opinion. He was arrested, given a trial that lasted months, refused permission to properly defend himself, and on July 6, 1415, was tied to a stake in a public square and set on fire while thousands watched. Before the flames reached him, witnesses recorded that he was heard praying quietly. He was 45 years old. Law 5. Leaving your village was illegal. Most people alive in medieval Europe were not free. They were serfs, legally bound to the land where they were born. Not slaves, technically, but not free either. A serf in 13th century France could not move to another village, could not marry without the lord's permission, could not leave the estate without written approval. One documented case from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris shows a serf named Bertrand who attempted to relocate to a neighboring town after his wife died. He was caught, brought back, fined, and forced to provide an additional year of unpaid labor as punishment. He had simply tried to start over somewhere new. That was illegal. Law 6. A lawyer was appointed to defend a swarm of locusts. Stop. because this is the part of the video where most people pause and say, that cannot be real. In 1545, in the village of Saint-Julien in southeastern France, the local vineyards were being destroyed by weevils, small beetles, insects. The farmers were losing everything, so they did what any rational medieval community would do. They sued the weevils in an official court of law. The insects were formally charged with felonious trespass and willful destruction of crops. A lawyer named Antoine Filial was appointed by the court to defend the weevils. His argument? That God had created the insects before he created man. Therefore, they had a natural right to eat the plants of the earth. The trial lasted weeks. The court ultimately asked the weevils to relocate voluntarily to a separate plot of land set aside for them by the village. The weevils did not comply. A second trial was held in 1587. The court records from this second trial end mid-sentence. No one knows why. No verdict was ever recorded. The case remains officially unresolved. This was not unusual. Between the 9th and 18th centuries, hundreds of animal trials were documented across Europe. Pigs, horses, rats, moles, and caterpillars were all formally prosecuted in courts of law. In several cases, the animals were given legal representation. Some were acquitted. Law 7, trial by combat, was a legal right. In 1351, in a field outside Paris, two French knights, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris, fought to the death before the King of France and thousands of spectators. The reason? Jean de Carouge accused Jacques Le Gris of assaulting his wife Marguerite. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no confession, so the court ordered what French law permitted, a duel to determine truth. If Jean won, Jacques was guilty. If Jacques won, Jean was considered a liar, and Marguerite would be burned alive for making a false accusation. Jean de Carouge won. Jacques Le Gris was dragged from the field and hanged. Marguerite de Carouge watched every second of it. This was the last officially sanctioned trial by combat in French history, and it only ended because a woman's life depended on her husband's sword arm. Law 8. Executions were the biggest show in town. On June 2, 1535, in London, a crowd of over 10,000 people gathered at Tyburn, the city's public execution site. They had come to watch. Vendors moved through the crowd selling meat pies and ale. Families claimed spots hours in advance. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. The condemned that day was a man named Thomas More, former Lord Chancellor of England, scholar, author. He had refused to endorse King Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church. For that, he was beheaded. The crowd roared. By the end of the medieval period, public executions had become so popular in some cities that viewing stands were built and rented out for profit. You could buy a seat to watch a man die, and it was considered completely normal. 1,000 years of medieval law reveal one consistent truth. The law was never neutral. It protected land, titles, and power. It punished poverty, dissent, and difference. A pig could be dressed in human clothes and hanged. A scholar could be burned for writing a pamphlet. A woman's life could depend on the outcome of a sword fight, and a swarm of insects could be taken to court and given a lawyer. History doesn't just teach us about the past. It shows us exactly how fragile the idea of justice has always been. If you made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Every video on Savage Century goes deeper. Real names, real cases, real history that sounds like it shouldn't be true. Subscribe now because the next episode goes somewhere even darker. And leave a comment. Which of these 8 laws shocked you the most?